we're working really hard to keep within the fluid nature of everything that changes with COVID-19. But the one thing that doesn't change is our world and the environment and all the issues that we've been dealing with before COVID. And all of us, including the speaker today and Ding Darling, we've got Sarah Burnshead with FWC. You know, everybody's out there working and continuing the job at conservation and protecting our environment and wildlife, and we appreciate your interest in being here. I'm Bergie Miller. I'm the executive director of the Ding Darling Wildlife Society, which is the nonprofit arm of the refuge. And rather than hear me speak, I'm going to have, I know many of you are longtime lecture attendees, you've seen this video, but I'm going to show it again because I think it's really good, and it gives you a snapshot of who we are as an organization, and then I'll make a few more comments and recognizing our sponsors and introducing our speaker. All right, April.
The J.N. Ding Darling National Wildlife Refuge of today isn't here by chance. In the early 1940s, J. Norwood Darling, for whom the refuge is now named, was instrumental in the effort to block the sale of environmentally valuable land to developers. Ultimately, at his urging, President Harry S. Truman signed an executive order creating this refuge in 1945. In 1982, the Ding Darling Wildlife Society Friends of the Refuge began. Its purpose was to educate visitors about the importance of protecting lands, waters, and wildlife. In 1999, this group of volunteers stepped up to lead the building of the refuge's Visitor and Education Center. This was the first partnership of its kind, where a Friends group raised money to construct a federal building. And it is still the hub of the refuge today. Why was this necessary? And what is the Society's role today? Well, over the decades, the refuge budget has been cut 60%, and it has half the staff it formerly did. Meanwhile, visitors have increased 66% to nearly 1 million people annually. The refuge cannot meet their growing needs alone. So the Ding Darling Wildlife Society works to fill in the gaps where federal funding falls short. Most importantly, the refuge keeps Ding Darling's spirit alive by educating generation after generation about the importance of conservation, so visitors from around the world will take that knowledge back to the communities where they live. Today, with the help of generous donors, the Society supports the refuge in these primary areas: land acquisition and restoration, advocacy, conservation education, wildlife protection, biology and water quality research, and internships.
What really draws people to Sanibel and the core objective of people is to come and enjoy the J.N. Ding Darling National Wildlife Refuge. I think Ding Darling would just be ecstatic over the fact that there are people that are carrying on his legacy. I mean, he obviously gave from his pocketbook, gave from his heart, but he would be ever so gratified to know that that legacy that he started continues today.
The best legacies are not what you do for yourself today, but what you do for the next generation.
I wanted to be at the refuge because there were things that I could do here. Every time I come to volunteer, I see the important work that's being done by the Ding Darling Wildlife Society. I see the smile on children's faces and families who are enjoying nature and wildlife. It is so wonderful, it really is, to know that all of this work will be protected for the next generation because of the work that the Society has accomplished. Because if we don't do it, who will? Who will do it?
To that end, the Ding Darling Wildlife Society is dedicated to ensuring that Ding's legacy lives on at the J.N. Ding Darling National Wildlife Refuge. We invite you to join us and our thousands of members in supporting the refuge for generations to come.
So that gives you a nice snapshot of who we are, and it takes people like all of us in this room who care. A lot of those beginning volunteers that helped to build that first building, their kids are now in this room, which is pretty cool. We have generations of people supporting the refuge, and it's fun hearing people come up with why I was here as a little baby and now I'm bringing my grandchildren. So it's amazing, the Ding family, and you guys are all part of that family. So thank you for your interest and support. And as we said, it does take support. And the sponsors of this lecture, thank you, huge thanks to Hightower Advisors. We've got Jack Thomas and Trevor Schwartz with us today. Raise your hands, guys. They do everything from financial planning, investment management, retirement planning, estate planning, tax planning, liability management. They're great. Jack grew up on Woodring Point, which is here on Sanibel, and the Ding Darling Wildlife Society worked with the refuge to protect that land there and the Woodring homestead, and he grew up there understanding and valuing the importance of saving lands and what we have left, and they've been strong supporters of ours throughout, and we appreciate your support of this lecture, so thank you very much. But you're here to hear Dr. Guggenheim, and I am here to introduce him. So our speaker today, Dr. Guggenheim, is a marine scientist, a conservation policy specialist, a submarine pilot, an ocean explorer, and an educator. He is the founder and president of the Washington, D.C.-based nonprofit organization Ocean Doctor, and he and Ocean Doctor are dedicated to advancing the conservation of the world's oceans through scientific research, education, and community engagement. He holds a PhD in environmental science and public policy from George Mason University, a master's in aquatic and population biology from the University of California, and a master's in regional science and bachelor's degree in environmental studies from the University of Pennsylvania. He is working to advance cutting-edge technologies for sustainable aquaculture practices to the Americas to reduce pressure on overfished wild fish stocks. He played a lead role in forming the Gulf of Mexico Alliance, a partnership among the U.S. Gulf states, 13 federal agencies, and Mexico. He makes frequent speaking and television and radio appearances, having appeared on 60 Minutes, ABC's Good Morning America, CNN, MSNBC, and NPR. Lessons from the Deep, what the oceans are telling us and why it matters. Dr. Guggenheim is here to tell us, so please join me in welcoming Dr. Guggenheim.
That feels good. But you have to see the rest of the face. I'm sorry about that. Thank you so much. This is a very special place. It brings back memories. I ran the Conservancy of Southwest Florida in Naples for 4 years. And for those of you who are volunteers, I bow to you. It's something very, very special, and organizations like this couldn't exist without you, so thank you. And also I add my thanks to Jack and Trevor for their support. I know as a fundraiser, as a, especially in these times, support like yours is incredibly important. So, that is the synagogue where I had my bar mitzvah about 100 years ago. That's Rodef Shalom in Philadelphia. Pretty magnificent. And I think the people who built buildings like this, houses of worship, churches, mosques, synagogues, they knew something. Because you walk in and you feel small. You feel very small in this grand place, and yet at the same time you feel connected to something larger than yourself. It's an interesting combination, and it's actually exactly how I feel when I'm in a tiny little sub a few thousand feet below the surface, all by my own, but feeling so connected to that vast ecosystem and the life in there that exists. This is Bob Ballard. You may know him as the discoverer of the Titanic. I don't know him well, but we've met a few times, and he will tell you that is not the coolest thing he's ever discovered. This is the coolest thing he ever discovered. These are black smokers. These are off of the Oregon-Washington coast. That is superheated water that actually began to melt their sub. And those tube worms that you see are about 9 feet tall. This is thousands of feet below the surface. So if you're like me, you were taught by your biology teacher, life cannot exist without sunlight. Wrong. Totally wrong. We were misinformed. This ecosystem lives on H2S, sulfuric acid basically, and some clever bacteria turn that into food. And so it's a completely, ecosystem living in the dark, changing our whole perception of science. And we're just learning something new every day. There's blind crabs in there and mussels, all sorts of things. So every time I get into the water, and you'll hear this from scuba divers, any divers here, you always see something new, right? Something you've not really seen before. So we're just at this early stage of exploration. Right off this coast, 150 miles, is the deepest reef in North America. This is about 300 feet deep. These are plate-like corals called agaricea. And they recently finished the census of marine life, where they found all kinds of crazy stuff. This is called the Yeti crab, sort of homage to Star Wars. There's also something named after Bob Marley, but the coolest, weirdest thing, this is called the barrelhead. Its head is clear, and those two little things in front are not its eyes. Its eyes are those green things. So it sees through its own head. How weird is that? So there are mysteries of deep. We really are at the Lewis and Clark stage of exploring our oceans. It's estimated we've explored 5% of the biology that lives in our oceans. And back in the early 1800s, when Thomas Jefferson sent Lewis and Clark out to explore all this new territory, it was the same. One of the best reads is the original journals of Lewis and Clark. I highly recommend it. And their adventures are legendary. And it came at a time when the size of the United States pretty much doubled under Jefferson. The Louisiana Purchase pretty much doubled the size of the United States. Well, 100 years later, it happened again. March 10th, 1983, I think. It was right around the last episode of MASH. Just as a point, as a marker. But if you don't know what I'm talking about, you're certainly not alone. This is a hint. But Ronald Reagan signed this executive order, proclamation, extending our territorial waters, our exclusive economic zone, out to 200 miles. And look what that did to the United States. All of that light blue is ocean territory. It more than doubled the size of the United States, just like the Louisiana Purchase, but this was salt water. So the saltwater part of our country is actually larger than the landmass. So guess what? We live in an ocean nation. We are ocean dwellers, all of us. But we literally know more about the backside of the moon than we do about the bottom of the oceans. We've mapped the backside of the far side of the moon. We have not mapped our oceans. 1960, this is called the Bathyscap Trieste. 2 pilots got in to explore the deepest part of our ocean, 7 miles deep, the Mariana Trench, which means if you dropped Mount Everest into the Mariana Trench, there it goes, and you climbed to the top of Mount Everest and looked above your head, there would still be another mile of water above your head. That's deep, and building a craft to sustain that depth was pretty challenging, especially back then with all the modern technology that was available to them there. But these 2 pilots made it safely. One of the portholes did crack under 16,000 pounds of pressure, but it did not. They continued with the mission all the way to the bottom, and they looked out that porthole, and guess what they saw? They saw two eyes looking back, as Sylvia Earle would say. They saw a flat fish swimming along the bottom. Amazing that life could exist that far down. And the thing is, we all know the first person to set foot on the moon, Neil Armstrong. The second person, of course, Buzz Aldrin, very good. But who knows the names of the two pilots that piloted this legendary expedition? Well, that's Don Walsh. We are at an Explorers Club dinner there. And the second one, that's Don in the back. The one closest to us is Jacques Picard, part of the famous French family, that explorer family, and a French explorer. So those two. And by the way, if that name Jacques Picard sounds a little familiar, it isn't an accident. Jean Roddenberry named Jean-Luc Picard, captain of the Enterprise D&E, to pay homage to the great Picard family. So, next cocktail party, which is coming up in a few hours, you can use that, you have my permission. But isn't it amazing that it was decades later that we went back, and it was James Cameron, the filmmaker, and of course he tweets from the bottom of the ocean. But it just shows the neglect more than 50 years later. We hadn't been back. I went to Alaska with Greenpeace, of all places. It was a research mission, so we didn't have to chain ourselves to a nuclear facility. But great ship to be on. And these are two one-person submarines that'll take you to 2,000 feet. Jemchug Canyon in the Bering Sea is the largest underwater canyon in the world, and Pribilof Canyon is the second. And by the luck of the draw, we had a coffee cup with little numbers in it in the galley. I chose number 1, so I became the first human being to take a manned sub into Jemchug Canyon. And just to give you a sense of the size, this is a
With
little
our
clip from
virtual Earth,
BBC.
we can drain all the water from Monterey Bay Canyon.
So this is
It
Monterey.
took around 10 million years to carve this canyon into the side of the continental shelf. But if you think that's big, just hold on. A few thousand miles northwest of California, just off the coast of Russia, there's a canyon that makes Monterey look like a tin.
We know. And the reason we were there is to find coral. Now that's the last place you'd expect to find coral. We think of coral here in Florida, down in the Keys, in Puerto Rico, and Cuba. But coral, cold water corals exist everywhere. The other thing that you may not know about corals is that they are some of the oldest living creatures, probably the oldest living animal on the planet. They can live to be 4,000 years old. Incredibly slow growing, older than the redwoods, way older. So we were taking these subs down, and I'll talk a little bit more about this in a couple minutes, but we took the subs down to about 2,000 feet to document it, but I was frustrated. Like the sub, you can see it's got these bright lights on it, it's very noisy inside, the life support systems, big fans. So I did what you're not supposed to do. I turned it off. I mean, fortunately, it's not like an old Dodge where you got to crank it to get it to start up again. But I wanted to see what it was like to really be there. And I'm staring out, and I suddenly see a flash of light. And then I saw another light, and all of a sudden, I was in the middle of a light show. There was a party going on, there was a conversation going on. I had no idea what they were talking about. But scientists believe, oh, we do have the disco ball. Scientists actually believe that, okay, I think I've gone too far now. That is a lanternfish, also uses light. Scientists believe that light might be the most common form of communication in the world, given how much of our planet is in darkness and how light is used in the deep sea to communicate. So that's a very active form of communication, or of research. Okay, I'm switching topics now, dramatically, as you can see. Anybody know the best documentary, 1952? Come on. Okay. So you've heard of Rachel Carson's Silent Spring. Well, she wrote another book called The Sea Around Us that was put in the hands of Irwin Allen, if you know the name. Classics like Land of the Giants, Towering Inferno, Lost in Space. Anyway, that'll give you a clue, but here is the documentary film winner, just a clip. Definitely not true.
Armed with his underwater spear, man pursues the giant. This is one of the most dangerous of sports. Unless the man's first shot is true, he runs the risk of a watery death. Equally as deadly and twice as cunning as the man is the vicious moray eel. If in all the seas there's a creature hated more than the shark by fish and fishermen alike, it's the moray eel. All the fury of the sea explodes in this snake-like killer. The jaws snap, the tail clashes, the hate becomes a living thing. New danger. The killer shark is attracted by the blood. The man attempts to escape. Look out! The fight is short and one-sided.
Okay, I will spare you the rest of that, because then they go on to whales. I was horrified when I when I got that. I found it on eBay, and it was horrifying. And then all of a sudden I realized, wait a minute, I should feel good. Because we look at these creatures, we don't call them monsters. We love the oceans now. Things have really changed. Our attitudes have really come a long way. But in some ways, I think some of those old attitudes still persist. And one of them is that the oceans are so large and so vast that there's nothing that we puny humans could possibly do to disrupt them. I think when we think about the oceans, we think about, and the biggest challenge to the oceans, we often think about pollution. It's usually the first thing people think about. And we think about pipes with toxic waste coming out of them. And the fact is, that was the case. You may remember rivers catching fire, the Cuyahoga River. But thanks to President Nixon and his administration, Republican, the Clean Water Act was passed. Many other landmark pieces of legislation were passed, and we've cleaned those up. We don't have those sorts of problems anymore. We have other sorts of problems, Deepwater Horizon. I did a documentary film, which you can see on YouTube, about a ship that was not an oil tanker that killed tens of thousands of penguins in the South Atlantic. from its oil, just the fuel aboard. But the biggest issue we now face is not coming from oil tankers, it's not coming from toxic pipes, it's coming from our backyards. And it's coming from our agricultural fields. It's nutrient pollution, fertilizer. And what happens is there's runoff, that's Naples, by the way. We seem to love our lawns a little too much. I love this from New Jersey, because it's saying if you fertilize too much, all of that nitrogen goes down the river, into the ocean, and it does exactly the same thing there that it does on your lawn. It promotes the growth of plants or algae. They die. The oxygen goes to work, the bacteria to break them down. That sucks all the oxygen out of the water so fish and other creatures can't live, and those are called dead zones. And if you look at the country, more than 40% of our country, even a little bit of Manitoba in Canada, drain into the Gulf of Mexico. A lot of that's ag land. And look what we find at the mouth of the Mississippi. It's a dead zone the size of New Jersey. And it's disgusting. And it's sad that it's come to that. But that's nutrient pollution, and that's a huge challenge for us. There you can kind of get a better idea. And as I said, these dead zones occur all over the country and all over the world. Here in Florida, you've got the Florida Yards and Neighborhoods program. Before I left Naples, I was going to kill my lawn and do that, have a big campaign, but it never happened. But replanting with native vegetation. It likes to be here. You don't have to water it. I think one of the important points here is the relationship of land and water, and I don't think there's a better example than the Everglades. I was co-chair of the Everglades. My co-chair has just been appointed the head of the Fish and Wildlife Service, by the way. I'm very proud of her, Shannon Estenos. The Everglades is not just Everglades National Park, it's an entire vast ecosystem that starts at Disney World, basically. Well, it wasn't there before. And it affects our waters. It affects the waters here in Sanibel. It affects the waters as far down as the Florida Keys. People didn't like the Everglades very much. It is, in fact, the most hideous region to live in. And so draining it seemed like a very good idea, this dreaded swamp. Of course, there were hurricanes that killed a lot of people that came along that were also factors. But today you can see this is a compartmentalized system with thousands of miles of canals and pumps. It's a man-managed system, human-managed system, pardon me. And I don't think I have to tell anyone here the situation with Lake Okeechobee, with algal blooms, and then worse, the releases from Lake Okeechobee with dead plankton, high in nutrients, and of course right there into Southwest Florida and Sanibel. It is frightening and highly toxic waste that leads to harmful algal blooms and everything else. There's an aerial shot from the Sanibel Captiva Foundation. I look at my remarks when I testified before Congress a long time ago, and I think one of the things I said here was we've disrupted our fresh water. Twist on this, we've managed to make fresh water a pollutant because of all the paved surfaces. That water runs off so fast. It's not like the flow, the go slow flow of the Everglades. It rushes into areas. This is from last year. This is a salinity chart. So in Ruffy Bay. So high on that chart is, medium salinity. Estuaries depend on a very delicate balance of fresh and salt water. But you can see what happens back in July is when that, all of a sudden you have practically fresh water in an estuary. This is where these are nursery grounds for our fish. That is mortal to those juvenile fish. So Naples Bay surrounded by some of the most expensive real estate in the world, is a dead bay. I've been in it. It's all these pulses of fresh water that pretty much kill everything. So the good news is we have a plan to fix it. We're replumbing the Everglades. It is the largest environmental restoration in human history, and it's right here in our backyards. And I have to say, we, standing here, are in the greater Everglades ecosystem. We're all part of that, and it's important to remember. It's also important to remember that Winnie the Pooh lives in see the jacket and all of that? See, Disney thought it had the whole concession figured out. My belief is that it's nutrient pollution, as bad as it is terrible, but I think one of the biggest problems we face is overfishing. This is a smart guy in the late 1800s, and he believed fisheries were inexhaustible, and it was absolutely useless to try to regulate the fishing. Fish were jumping out of the water into your little fishing skiff in New England, the codfish, right? He couldn't imagine that Canada and then the United States would call it an end to cod fishing. Those populations have crashed and they're not coming back. I mean, hopefully they will, but it's been 20 years. We've had a 90% decline in predatory fish, sharks, swordfish, tuna. We love those tasty big predators. And I don't think he could have imagined a Russian trawler of that scale. And I have a video to go with it. Look at the size of this net. That is not fishing with hook and line on a small skiff off of New England. That is tons and tons and tons of fish coming aboard that trawler. These are factory ships that process on line. I mean, it's still talking about it, it's still coming aboard. But you can get a sense of just how big. I have a feeling somebody clandestinely took this video. That's a lot of fish. But a lot of us have this look on our face like, but there's fish at the supermarket, there's fish at Whole Foods, there's fish everywhere, there's all you can eat fish. Where's this fish? You know, if we have this problem, well, most of the fish we're eating is imported. Sanibel's probably an exception because you're right here by the ocean, but a lot of it is also farmed fish as well. But the thing is, we manage fishing as the same way we manage corn, as if they're crops growing in the ocean. Instead of maximum sustainable yield, we call it total allowable catch, but it's basically the same thing. It's primitive. It doesn't consider the ecosystem. It also doesn't consider the fact that this is not a piece of corn. Oh, I love this face. It's a grouper, a red hind. These guys have work to do. They're part of the ecosystem. They're not crops that grow separate from the ecosystem. Grouper are ecosystem engineers. They dig huge holes that other fish use. The other problem is the way we fish. If we wanted to catch a squirrel today, we could go to the airport, charter a plane, drop a net, and drag it down through Sanibel. Squirrels here, of course. No? Yeah, okay. We got 1 million of them, actually more rats in DC, but we won't go into that. This is highly destructive. And that would be a really bad way to catch a squirrel because we catch mailboxes and lawyers and cars and, you know, it'd just be a mess, but that's bycatch. This is a trawl from the Gulf of Mexico for shrimp. Do you see a single shrimp in this picture? 80% of what's caught in a shrimp trawl is not shrimp. It's small fish that mostly die and are tossed back into the water. It's a huge amount of waste that we wouldn't tolerate from any other industry. And back to that picture of the coral in the Bering Sea, that's why we were there with Greenpeace. This is one of the, I took this shot, this is one of the most beautiful things I've ever seen underwater, one of my favorite things. And this is one of the worst things I've ever seen underwater. That's the other sub in the distance. And you see those lines? That's where a trawl has gone through. There is nothing left. It has destroyed all of that coral. In fact, I met some of the fishermen in the airport, and they recognized, of course I gave them a PowerPoint presentation at the gate, they recognized all those corals. They said, oh yeah, we see that on our deck all the time. And I said, that's why we're here. We don't want that on your deck. If you're eating mahi-mahi for lunch today, there is no guilt. These guys reproduce like bunnies. They're sexually mature at 4 to 5 months. They spawn every 2 to 3 days. Man, they are just reproduction machines. So that's a good choice. But we don't eat just that. I alluded to some other predators. If any of you from the Northeast, even down here, you may know dogfish. And look at the life history of a dogfish. This is a very differently constructed animal. A 23-month gestation period. They're not sexually mature until they're 13 years old, and they give live birth 5 to 6 pups. 23 months is like the gestation period of the African elephant. This is not a good fish to fish on, but we are hammering those populations. By the way, I'm going to depress you for a little while longer, and then I promise I'll build you back up again. The other thing that's very interesting, there's a term called BOF, big old fecund female fish. We've all been taught, throw back the little ones, keep the big ones. I think that's on its head, because big fish, big females, it's an exponential function. They produce so many more young that it's better to leave the big fish in the water and take the little ones out and throw them in the frying pan. And finally, fishing, that's Hawaii. It's a seamount. And there's seamounts all over the ocean. But what's interesting about seamounts, I have to teach you a word if you don't already know it, is this concept of endemism, which means it's native to that one area and you don't find it anywhere else. And there's a huge level of endemism among these seamounts. And you can see 29 to 34%, one seamount are new to science and possibly endemic. And the problem is we are trawling and taking those fish and everything with it off of those seamounts because we've exhausted fish close to shore and we're moving offshore. One of the fish people are after is the orange Ruffy. If you Google it, you'll just get recipes. I have to show you a different story. This is a very unusual fish. Deep water, you find it around the world. Now, they're not sexually mature until they're between 23 and 40 years old. They give birth to something like 10% of the birth of other fish. Now, who knows how long an orange Ruffy can live? Throw out a number. 100? 50? Now, can you imagine eating a fish that was born before the Declaration of Independence? I wouldn't want to have that on my dinner plate, but that's what we're doing. And these fish really have limited capacity to reproduce themselves. And 60% of the oceans are unregulated right now. The high seas. So people are out without fishing regulation doing pretty much what they want. In your pockets and purses, right now, you have the two tools capable of dealing with this, your smartphone and your wallet or purse. Ask annoying question. This app, Seafood Watch, get it today, will tell you whether it's a good choice or a bad choice. Often your server won't know. So you gotta ask annoying questions, but that's part of conservation. But that's how the world changes. Part of the problem is we're forgetting how things used to be. We all think what we've seen in our own lifetime is what the planet has looked like. I went back to the logs of Christopher Columbus. Approaching Cuba, in this way, they saw turtles 3 to 4 feet long in such vast numbers that they covered the sea. They were even keeping the poor guys awake at night because they were banging against the hull. Nobody alive has ever seen anything like that. If you see one sea turtle, you go crazy. It's great. So, we've eaten 97% of these creatures. What about fishing for grouper right here in the Gulf of Mexico? You can see the difference in size and quantity of these fish, kind of like this. But we forget. These are kids in the Virgin Islands showing me their dad's biggest catch of the day. It's a parrotfish, a little snapper, grunt. Do those look like big fish? But they're growing up thinking that those are big fish. That's what you find at the market because they've killed all the big fish. There's other things. I'm not going to go into in depth in terms of climate change, baking cookies on your dashboard. We all know, we've heard enough about climate change, but its effects on the oceans are profound. And I won't talk about ice melting, but what I will talk about is the possible impact on these current systems. These are so important to life in the ocean and also the distribution of heat up the Gulf Stream, for example. Very, very important. Keeping with the Star Trek theme, climate change has an evil twin that you may not know about. More and more do know about it, and this is the only chemistry equation I'll show today, but if you combine water and carbon dioxide, same carbon dioxide in the atmosphere, you get carbonic acid, and that is eating away at anything with a calcium carbonate shell, periwinkle, mollusks, corals, and if you're familiar with the Great Cliffs of Dover, they're made up of coccolithophores, small plankton that happen to have a calcium carbonate, they call it a frustule. But down to the base of the food chain, ocean acidification is a great risk to our ecosystems. We're hearing a lot about plastics, so I won't cover it in detail, but you can see that seabirds in the Northwest Hawaiian Islands are ingesting this. There's entanglement, and it too is affecting the food chain down to the microscopic level. We're finding microplastics inside of plankton, and we're still figuring out what that impact could be. For a long time, we believed that extinction in the sea was impossible, but they found the relative of the manatee, stellar sea cow in the Arctic, very tasty, and it's gone. We had a seal here in the Caribbean monk seal. I still think we might find some. So many species, including marine species, are threatened with extinction. Another one is the northern right whale on the East Coast. Entanglement in lobster traps, especially. My beloved penguins. We're eating its food. We're eating krill, and it's also affected by climate change. I spent some time as chairman of the board of the Great Whale Conservancy, and we focused on blue whales, which have dropped incredibly down to very low levels. We thought we saved the whales. Remember Save the Whales? They're not saved yet. And one of the biggest threats to blue whales are ship collisions. And we're eating its food too, and climate change. I did some work at the Biosphere. I don't know if you remember this. I used to not tell people about it because I wasn't proud of it. It was a little bit of a crazy place, but they built this amazing facility in Tucson. They locked these biospherians in for 2 years to try to survive. It was basically sort of a pre-mission to Mars to see how people could survive. And a really fantastic structure, a 1 million gallon ocean. Well, things started to go wrong. Oxygen levels plummeted. The place was rusting and sucking up the oxygen. Carbon dioxide levels were approaching toxic levels. I was hired to figure out why. Too much soil respiration. In the end, and here you can see one of the emaciated scientists, believe it or not, that's me on the right. All of the vertebrates died. All of the pollinators died, so the plants were in bad shape. And the only thing that really did well were the cockroaches and ants, and they weren't even supposed to be in there. So it reminds me of this video, which you'll find on YouTube. You just do one little thing, and the entire ecosystem can unravel. And that's kind of where we are. By the way, everybody was okay. But I think it's a very visual illustration of how, I think it goes on forever, a very visual illustration of how fragile our ecosystem is and all of the connections, and we only have one. This is Biosphere 1. In the short time I have left, I'm going to build you up now. But one negative, then it's all going to be good. This is my Eastern Airlines ticket, if you remember Easter 1974, and I went to sea camp in the Florida Keys. Totally changed my life. This is what I saw. Beautiful, healthy elk-horned corals. 10 years later, it looked like this. 10 years later, 10 years later, 9 years later. 80 to 90% of the reefs in the Keys are dead. And roughly 50% of the coral reefs in the Caribbean, and really a worldwide figure, have died since 1970. It's tragic. And all the coral reefs in the world would fit inside the state of Texas. There aren't that many. And they're so important for rare species, for our economies, but they're like the princess and the pea. They hate everything. They're really, really sensitive. There are local threats like pollution and overfishing, destructive fishing practices, and global threats, climate change. So people like me long for a time machine. The DeLorean is our common icon of a time machine, and I found it. But it's not a DeLorean, it's a 51 Buick, or whatever that is. Cuba really came to my emotional rescue at a time I was ready to give up on coral reefs. my favorite part of that is the end where you see the pillar corals and the elkhorn corals and the black corals. It looks better than what I saw in 1974 in the Florida Keys. I couldn't believe it. It's sitting in the same hot water as our corals. This brain coral, so healthy. There's the pillar coral. It's a living laboratory for scientists like me. So of course the question is why? Well, part of it's an accident of history. Cuba's developed very different than the rest of us. They're forced to practice organic agriculture. The Soviets pulled out, and there went their funding for organic agriculture, or for fertilizers and pesticides. But they do have strong environmental laws, and they have a network of protected areas, 25%, a world leading figure. So the theory is they're doing very well on the local side, which may be giving these corals resilience to resist, be more, have more survivorship against the global threats. Think global, act local. We are connected to Cuba. That's one of the reasons we're studying down there. Cuban fish grow up to be American fish. There's scientific evidence of that. And sea turtles visit our beaches and they visit their beaches. We've done satellite tracking studies. The problem is we don't always get along. We share an ecosystem. If something goes wrong in the neighborhood, you work together, and that's really complicated with Cuba. One thing we've helped them do, this is their good boat at the University of Havana. We've helped them run 10 years of expeditions to map their Gulf of Mexico waters. Dozens of scientific papers came out of this. And I'm proud of the fact that we helped these graduate students get on a boat and do the study. That's kind of important if you want to be a marine biologist. I'm running low on time, but if you get on YouTube, you can see this little 60 Minutes piece. We brought Anderson Cooper down from 60 Minutes. By the way, for the record, I had the hair first. I'm a little older than him. But they wanted to see what a healthy reef looked like. I'm running low on time, so I'm going to skip over some of this. But another thing that gives me a lot of optimism is environmental economics. It's part of Cuban law, strange for a socialist country. We used to think of the environment as free. We took what we wanted, we dumped what we wanted. But now we're actually looking at the value of these ecosystems. This is a study by World Resources Institute with whom we've worked. It believes, look at the value of shoreline protection of coral reefs and mangroves. Way above fisheries, way above tourism, worth millions and millions of dollars. Coral reefs can absorb 97% of wave energy. It's very, very impressive. So if you do the math, building a seawall or restoring coral reefs, it's a factor of 15. It's a no-brainer. So back to whales. Because I'm a biologist, I'm allowed to say poop. A good friend of mine at the International Monetary Fund has done a study of the importance of whale poop to sequester carbon from the atmosphere. If you consider the number of whales, hundreds and thousands, millions of whales that used to exist, that was a significant amount of carbon. So again, looking at the economics, one whale can be worth $2 million just for climate. And one shark, according to a study in Palau, for tourism can be worth $1 million. So we've been working with our Cuban colleagues on a series of economic studies, environmental economic studies, here on the Isle of Youth, which is actually the 7th largest island in the Caribbean. Little boy learning to drive. And looking at the role of environmental economics to promote a sense of conservation in these poor coastal communities instead of taking too many fish out of the water. We've had exchange programs with students from Florida. Of course, spring break and that kind of tourism is not so healthy. So we wrote a report available on our website called A Century of Unsustainable Tourism in the Caribbean. But what we're really promoting in Cuba is not that kind of tourism, but small-scale tourism. This is the first bed and breakfast and dive center in a small community in the Isle of Youth. Small scale keeps the money in the community, because if you look at the Caribbean as a whole, 80% of the money does not stay in the Caribbean, goes to multinational corporations. So now I'm really wrapping up. I think we all feel great that people like Teddy Roosevelt existed, another Republican, who established our national park system. And now finally, we're starting to do the same thing underwater. Marine protected areas, Papahanaumokuakea, bipartisan, established by George W. Bush, doubled in size by Obama. Imagine that, bipartisanism. Bigger is better. Here's our friend the grouper again. And right here in Florida, we see that they need mangroves, they need corals, just like turtles need lots of territory. And there's movement on the high seas. There's a treaty that's about to be signed to actually protect those areas that are right now open to piracy and everything else. This is aquaculture, sustainable aquaculture. We've actually crossed the line. We're eating more farmed fish than we are wild fish. We helped a community in New Orleans, the largest Vietnamese American community outside of Vietnam, affected by Hurricane Katrina and the oil spill, to develop aquaculture. I'm traveling to all 50 states, talking to kids about the oceans. I think that's critical. It's something that they do here very well. Ding Darling. I'm about halfway through 23 states, trying to make a difference, open kids' eyes to the oceans. And these are my students at Johns Hopkins. And one of the groups has actually developed a program for Southwest Florida. I didn't encourage them, but there they went and did it. And we're hoping to work with the International Monetary Fund in Rookery Bay to really restore more of that. So I think our next generation is ready. They're going to have much cooler toys to play with to explore the oceans. I have something much cooler than Iron Man, who I met in Vegas. He's not very interesting. This is called the Exo Suit. Put on it's basically a wearable submarine. You put it on, go down 1,000 feet, come up, have lunch and coffee, and go right back down again. And because you're always at surface pressure, no big deal. And imagine putting it all together in an underwater city, your black smokers, your submarines, and there's Captain Kirk, keeping an eye on everything. So when Lewis and Clark finally came back, everybody thought they were dead. In 1806, they saw their first cow in 2.5 years. And that image of the West we will never see again. It's changed. But I think we have it right. And there are still remarkably beautiful places. And what does it say about us as human beings? I mean, we can protect the environment for our own selfish purposes, or we can protect it as part of our own humanity. Doesn't it say a lot about us as human beings and the way we treat nature around us? And you don't need a PhD to protect the environment. You ask annoying questions. You write letters. You go for a walk with your children or grandchildren. And every now and then, you stop and go to some place really grand and feel just a little bit smaller. Thank you very much.
Wow. And thank you. And I think the biggest message is just that, is we can all do our part, even if we think it's just a little teeny part. Those little teeny parts come into bigger parts and everybody working together, from the Teddy Roosevelts to the Ding Darlings to the Rachel Carsons to all these people before us. That's why we're here today as well. And I think it's important, like Dr. Guggenheim said, is we all work together. There's no one group or one organization who can do it all. We have to work together.